Good evening, everyone. And I want to welcome you to the Introduction to Community Development class. My name is Ava Gabrielle Watts, and I have been involved in community and economic development now for, I think it's 30 years this year. 30 years this year. Yeah, around 1992 is when I got started, a long time ago, right here on the Eastern Shore. A little small organization. I was hired as a community development coordinator of a small organization, then called the Northampton Housing Trust. And that was my title. We had to literally figure out what it was. I probably one of the first people on the shore to hold such a title, community development. The concept at that point on the New Eastern Shore was very new. And so a lot of us had to avail ourselves of a lot of information to learn how to do community, what later became community economic development. So when that position was created, I was kind of immersed in what was then a new and emerging field. At that point, it's been around for maybe about 20 years. And so today, this class is going to serve twofold. One, we have kind of established what we're calling the Capacity Building Institute, which is designed to help organizations like some of you in here work for and run and manage, and that I work for and run and manage. We're going to try to create a capacity building institute that's designed to do what we're starting to do tonight, to invest skills and training and opportunities to receive technical assistance into the organizations that are committed to this kind of work on the Eastern Shore, and into those who are committed to doing it, the individuals, so the organizations and the individuals who are committed to this work. We also want to invite new people to the field. I often say we kind of recycle the same warm bodies through various organizations. People go from, from the Planning District Commission to an organization like ours to some other organization and back again. Like you see them holding the same positions in 2 or 3 different organizations over and over and over again. There's really not a lot of fresh blood. There's not a lot of new energy. And we're all getting older. We really need to come up with a new pool of candidates to carry on this work. I don't want to be doing this 30 years from now, right? I'd like to retire one day. I hope you do too, right? We would like to be able to move on and bring another generation of community development leaders forward. I was in my 20s when I started in this work. And yesterday, we had a groundbreaking where we're doing 6 units of housing development in the community where I grew up. And one of the things that I found myself saying as I was giving my little talk at the start of the groundbreaking ceremony was that so many of the people, I was in my early 20s, and so many of the people that I started out with in this work, my mom included, and others, were my age then, and now they're all gone. And there are some of our original members who are, I think there's maybe only 1 or 2 left, who are in their 80s and 90s. And everyone else is gone. There may be 2 members left who started out with the original group. Everyone else is gone on. And so I look back and I thought they were young and vibrant then, right? And they were still active, and they were the people who pushed these agendas forward, and now they're all gone. And I was the baby, and now I'm in the place that they were in. We now have to do the work of bringing up another generation of community developers. So that's the twofold reason for this class. I hope that when we go through, as we begin to implement the Capacity Building Institute, those in the room and those who are on Zoom and others who will come to know this process will start organizations like the ones that we have and some of you have. We'll start organizations and begin to do some of this work yourselves. So that is the reason for this class. I wanted to start with definitions, right? People tend to use community economic development, housing, as though they are interchangeable definitions, and they really aren't. They all actually do have their own definitions their own purposes, their own missions, right? So I have kind of focused on the primary areas that you hear often when you're doing this kind of work, which is community development, economic development, community economic development, and housing. These two are really interchanged, as are these two, right? Oftentimes, you will hear people talk about economic development. I have even heard people say often that economic development, housing is economic development. I think by the time we get through this process today, you will agree with me that that's not the case, that there are always going to be some overlapping elements between each of these disciplines, but they are not the same. They're into the region where the different is. So let's look at community development to start. It says community development is a practice-based profession and an academic discipline that promotes participative democracy, sustainable development, rights, equality, economic opportunity, and social justice through the organization, education, and empowerment of people within their communities, whether these be of loyalty, locality, identity, or interest in urban and rural settings. That is a lot. That says a whole lot. My working definition of community development, that is all encompassing. But the real kind of rubber to the road, brass knuckles definition of community development are those activities that are performed to enhance, create, or establish amenities that will enhance the quality of life, right? Those activities that will support those amenities that enhance the quality of life in the community, right? And so often you'll see if you're developing a park, that's community development activity. If you are building a community center, a fire station, a community health center, all of those kind of can come under the activity of community development practices, right? There are a lot of working definitions. This one is very comprehensive, but it is a practice-based profession. That is true, right? It is kind of based on the practical implementation of those kinds of activities that create the quality of life, or better quality of life for people who live in there. And that's why they include things like sustainable development and democracy and rights, because the goal is to also serve some public good, right? Oftentimes the activities that happen in community development may look very much like activities that you would see in the private sector, but the mission should be different for community development activity. Key players in conventional community development that you would typically see, federal agencies are typically involved in community development activities, more often as funders of that kind of activity. The first two that come to mind would be what? HUD. HHS is another one that invests in. EPA has a whole community revitalization on there. So federal agencies, your state agencies, in our state, we call it our state department, Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. They fund things like community centers, fire stations, infrastructure. Infrastructure is unique because infrastructure that is for housing and community facilities and health facilities and fire stations is called community development. Infrastructure that is intended for business would be called economic development. So we'll get into some of those defining characteristics of how we distinguish one from the other. But in this state, our primary community development agency is Department of Housing and Community Development, but there are other departments in some of the other agencies that do fund similar kinds of work. So you may not be able to get your funding for the actual facility from one of those other agencies in the way that you could from the Department of Housing and Community Development, but you could get your funding for staffing in another agency, for example, or technical support and training, for example. Those are still community development activities, but they would not underwrite the actual hard capital. Local government, of course, most local governments have a community development division, or at least a community development staff person. More often than not, that person's job is to work with local communities who have an interest in building public facilities, right? That's their primary goal, is how can they invest, enhance, support, nurture public facilities, public buildings, public spaces that enhance the quality of life for the community. So that's the goal. And then local community organizations, oftentimes you'll find, and those can be sometimes quasi-governmental agencies, right? They have some government qualities. For example, the one that sticks out the most, of course, is the Planning District Commission, right? Planning District Commission are hardwired into state and federal legislation. So they are the primary intermediaries, as you know, for much of the funding that you can see that comes out of the federal and state agencies. For the federal government, for example, if you want to get community development block grants, particularly in a rural community, you almost have to go through your local planning district commission, or they have to at least have a role. You have to identify their role in the process. If the funds don't come directly through them, you have to at least identify their role. Community organizations, though, can also be nonprofit organizations. They can be institutions like this, higher education. They can be school systems. They can be other kinds of social services organizations. Any organization that would find itself in the space to be able to do activities that will enhance the overall quality of life for its citizens might find themselves engaged. Let's look at a definition for economic development. Economic development promotes economic well-being and quality of life for communities by creating, retaining, expanding jobs that facilitate growth, enhance wealth, and provide a stable tax base. So, as you can see, community development is about creating those kind of spaces and opportunities and facilities that enhances the quality of life, those amenities that enhance the quality of life in the community. And economic development is about putting those things in motion so that they can generate revenue for the local coffers. So that's a different function. Economic development is about creating a revenue base for the city, the county, the locality, municipality, where it is located. Sometimes it can be even done in partnership, regional partnerships of multiple municipalities or localities, if it's a large enough project. But the goal there is resources for the locality. This is where you expect to expand your economy for your revenue, for your tax base. This is a lot of words, but I wanted to put it in here because it kind of explains it well, and I'll read it to you. It's kind of, because this is an important piece, and you notice that I highlighted economic growth and economic development, because oftentimes those are two other words that people use interchangeably, and they are not interchangeable, right? Economic growth is simply an increase in aggregate output. So you can grow your economy without doing any development. So let's say you're in a place where a very mineral wealthy community. So you have like diamonds, right? Let's say we're somewhere where they have diamonds. They don't need a lot of people to mine the diamonds because they got technology now that's kind of doing all of that work for them. So they need just a few people to do the work, but there's a lot of wealth there. So your economy will grow, but you're not really doing development because you're not really sharing the wealth throughout the labor market in order to generate revenue and increase the output of the region for the people in the area. So the distinction between economic development is that it's about LSF here, remember, here. It's about creating, retaining, and expanding jobs that facilitate growth, right? Facilitate growth, but it is not, but growth is something different. The growth is the actual expansion of the economy. So economic growth is simply concerned with the increase in aggregate output, while economic development is concerned with quality improvement and the introduction of new goods and services, risk mitigation, and the dynamics of innovation and entrepreneurship. So those are the different, and I'm gonna turn that down just a little bit. Those are the kinds of activities that you will expect to see in economic development. So economic development is about positioning the economy of an area on a higher growth trajectory. So do we see the distinction between the two? One is about expanding the economy. The other is about those activities that you would do to spread the wealth and also expand the economy, right? It's about building the capacity of people and the jobs that are created, entrepreneurship, innovation. So I wanted to kind of point that out. It says of the two, economic development is less uniquely a function of market forces. It is the product of long-term investment in the generation of new ideas, knowledge transfer, and infrastructure. You can grow your economy quickly with just about any industry, right? That's where a lot of those conversations come from of what to do in rural communities. Do we want big, gigantic waste plants? Do we want prisons? There are a lot of revenue generating industry sectors that you can mine every tree in your town and you can grow your economy, but is it sustainable, right? So economic development is about ideas. It's about innovative thinking. It's about how do we, one, enhance the sustainability of our community, right? It's about how we enhance the sustainability of our community, but it is also about growing the economy, right? Because that's good for everyone. Although, so back in, it was 2019, I was asked by the United Nations to lead there. So the United Nations came up with this 2030 plan for sustainable development goals. And there are like 30 different areas. One is eliminate poverty, all these lofty ideas, eliminate poverty, create this number of jobs, have economic growth of this percentage in every nation that's underdeveloped, blah, 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 healthcare for everyone, all these lofty ideas. And number 8 was job creation, that every person in the world would have a living wage job and economic growth in every underserved community or something like that. I can't remember what it is. But anyway, one of the things that we did, so we had to pull together a team. I was asked to kind of lead the team that would draft the position paper for that year. And one of the things that we talked about in our working group sessions was that it doesn't necessarily, economic growth does not automatically translate into economic benefit to the folks that live there, right? The Appalachian Regional Commission is an example of that. Many years ago, the Appalachian Regional Commission was established by President Kennedy back in 1965. It was designed to make economic development investments into the Appalachian region of the country to help to lift folks out of poverty in that part of the nation. The first thing they did was invest in infrastructure, right? Infrastructure is one of those key economic development engines that if you invest in infrastructure, then you can build the plants, you can build the job, create the jobs so that people can come to the region and economic growth can occur. So the first thing that they did in that part of the country was they spent billions of dollars over the last 60 years in the Appalachian Highway system. It's been like $8 billion coming out of it. They poured money into that region. The goal there was to build that highway system because those people were kind of separated from the commerce of the rest of the country by those mountains. And so they weren't able to engage in commerce. So they cut through those mountains, built that massive highway system, and lo and behold, Nashville happened, and Memphis happened, and Birmingham happened, and all of these cities that have kind of exploded in the last 60 years, right down that Appalachian corridor, was because they focused on building it so that they could create the jobs, so that they could attract people. What they realized though, that they could attract the industry, right? What they realized though, going through that process, is that they created the jobs, they built the place, but the people who were right there, the indigenous people who had been in Appalachia the whole time, the ones they were originally trying to affect their lives, did not benefit right away from the opportunity. Folks came to the region and took those well-paid jobs because they also had to make some investments in the workforce. So the definition of economic development then expanded to also include making investments into your workforce, in addition to into the infrastructure, into the industry, into these activities that we're looking at here. So it says economic development requires collective action and large-scale, long horizon investment. And it addresses the fundamental conditions necessary for microeconomic functioning of the economy. It basically means those things that we have to do to make sure that the individual needs are met in our region. And I also highlighted this part, because this is also a big conversation that I have. I sit on an economic development committee here in this region of the state, and I can't tell you how many times we sit at this table and debate this conversation. It is within the purview of government. It stands to reason that if the primary goal of economic development is to retain jobs, make investments in infrastructure, and kind of do those incentive-based activities that will recruit and establish businesses in your area, that would be led by who? Exactly. But somehow, there is a confusion, particularly here, that all kinds of activities qualify as economic development. And I for the life of me, I gave up a couple of years ago talking about it because it was frustrating. So the players in economic development, since it is within the purview of government, largely falls within the purview of government, federal agencies. Who can think of who the primary economic development agency is for this country? I just said it. EDA. So EDA, economic development. But HUD also will invest in, USDA will invest in, HUD will invest in. USDA just gave the town of Exmoor something like $10 million in infrastructure to be in dollars for infrastructure in order for it to be able to connect to HRSP. So a lot of federal agencies invest in those kind of activities, but EDA is the one that it is their mission. There is their mission. State agencies. So who would be the state agency that we look to in this state for economic development activities? Clark. Anybody else? I guess that agency is. We talked about it today on our call. We're gonna meet with them.
I was paying attention, but I still don't know. Are you talking about the Department of Community and Housing?
They're the community development, but they will fund some kind of. So if you've ever been to the Governor's Conference on Housing, you know that economic development is a big part of the conversation with DHCD because they will fund economic development activity, but it's not their core mission. Their core mission is community development and housing activity. But we understand, and we're going to talk about it in a second, those things kind of go hand in hand. They're not the same things, but they do work together, kind of, and synergy is necessary often. VEDP in Virginia is the primary economic development agency. That's the agency that you go to when you are looking to put together, for example, an incentive package to recruit a particular industry or company.
So what are the names standing for?
Virginia Economic Development Partnership. Yeah. But as I said, other agencies do also invest in those kinds of activities. Local government can put together incentive packages for an industry to come. They can come in tax credits. They can come in actual cash dollars. I said in-kind contributions in terms of, we'll build the roads, or we'll put in the water and sewer, we'll do some portion of this project for you in order to get you funds. So they actually different variations of things that local governments will do to incentivize an industry to come to a region or create a job. And then you have your quasi-governmental organizations. Typically that's here. Some areas have RPAs, have regional planning associations. Some have regional planning commissions in addition to their planning district commission. We only have the planning district commission, but it has, as you guys know, a huge umbrella that has a whole bunch of different agencies under it. In a lot of other places, those would be separate organizations, separate agencies, separate governance, separate staff. But in here, we kind of put it all under one umbrella. And so those quasi-governmental organizations typically are, as I said, in many cases, like in the case of plan distribution, are oftentimes hardwired into the federal legislation for how those resources should come to a particular area. So they will say, they specifically state these funds must go through an intermediary, and it'll name, depending on what they're called in different parts of the state, local development council, they're called councils of government, they're called planning district commissions, they're LDDs, LDCs, all different kinds of things, but all of them kind of come under this same umbrella. And they are federally legislated intermediaries. And that's why, because they are so heavily entrenched in the legislation, it's almost impossible to not include them in your in whatever effort. So if economic development is the function of investing in infrastructure, right, and hard assets, and building the capacity of the local labor force to meet the needs of an industry. Now, keep in mind, right, economic development is building the capacity of the workforce to respond to an industry need, right, an industry requirement. Community economic development will focus on the same things, but it was to increase the capacity of the individual, right? So you see the difference. The community economic development is typically those kind of activities that would be guided by the community. So if Myra wanted to ensure that people in her community were equipped to be able to start their own businesses or respond to job opportunities in a particular business that was coming to town or something like that, then Bayside decided to put together some kind of workforce development and training initiative. That would be considered community economic development. Do you see the distinction? That's the kind of activity that is typically guided by local community organizations and the people that run them for the people in those communities. So that's the distinction, right? Economic development is under the purview of government. It's typically to do the functions that are necessary to increase the scale and capacity of industry in a region. This is designed to increase the scale and capacity of the people in that region to respond to industry opportunity. Am I making a clear distinction there for you? Can you repeat that again, everyone? The distinction between economic development and community economic development is economic development is designed to respond to the needs of industry with hard assets and or workforce improvements in things that you need to do to improve the labor force, for the labor force to be able to respond to the needs of industry. Community economic development has a different focus. Community economic development is designed to focus on the community and the needs of the people in the community to respond to industry needs, right? So I'll give you an example. Many years ago, when I was in Alabama, the state of Alabama was then attracting all the automotive industry to the state. They were investing. I mean, like, there were people who thought it was good. They literally almost bankrupted the state trying to attract Mercedes to Alabama years ago. I mean, they just threw the whole state budget And they say that, you know, as we said earlier, remember we said about those long-term investments? That was a long-term investment. They invested something like $250,000 for each job in a year for like 10 years when they added it all up. It was something crazy, tons of money that they literally threw at Mercedes to come. After Mercedes came, however, it was a long shot goal, but it kind of paid off because then Toyota came. When Toyota got ready to come, they were geared up to do the very same thing. But Toyota, two of the counties that were right there near where the Toyota plant was going, they were hoping, two of the neighboring counties, they threw all of their money in as well. And their hope was that they would be able to land at least one of the tier 1 plants. So you have tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 plants. The tier 1 plants are the plants that make the core pieces of the car. The tier 2 plants are the pieces that go in the core pieces of the car, and the tier 3 stuff is accessory stuff, the kind of answer that goes into the piece that goes into the piece that goes in. So they wanted some tier 1 plants right there in those 2 counties. And when Toyota did their analysis, they determined that they could not, they had to go, in some cases, over the state line back to Georgia, into Georgia, because had they tried to come too close, they would have driven the wage rates up so high that they wouldn't have been competitive because they did not have enough skilled labor in that area where proximity of where the plant occurred. So those are all the things that you have to think about. So then what would have been the response from the local governments in order to, over time, alleviate that issue, right? Then they have to now invest in their labor pool to get their labor pool up to speed so they won't have that problem in the future. What would be the response from a local community organization that says this plant is coming and I don't care if you have to drive to Georgia, we want to make sure that you have the skills, know what you need to know to be able to go to that job? That would be community. That's kind of the distinction between the two. A lot of times people include rehabilitating affordable housing and community economic development as it's connected. So an example of this is, I used to know a guy by the name of Don's last name? Can't remember. But he had the most amazing community economic development model in Kansas City, Missouri. His model was to, this is in the 80s, he went and got convicts, ex-convicts, people who come out there to train them in the trades. He worked with the judge, said, well, if you let them out, I want to keep them and I want to train them. He trained them in all of the trades and created a construction company using the labor, using the training program, and they did housing rehabilitation in Kansas City and then sold and leased out the properties for affordable housing. And then once he got the construction company up and running, they sent kids to school, got them trained to be architects, sent them trained, so they became a full service construction company, all owned by the community-based organization. So that was a full community economic development model housed in that organization. And then they started a pallet making company where they made pallets for companies that need to move large items on that. Because they had extra wood or something that from the construction stuff, they took the wood and started a pallet making company, and the pallet making company made a lot of money. He had his whole organization was called the Kansas City, I think it was the Kansas City Community Development Corporation. I think it was KCCDC. Now that I think about it. But their whole model was a community economic development model that was designed to support affordable housing. Typically the key players in community economic development are community development organizations, kind of we just talked about. Community action agencies sometimes participate in community economic development activities. Other kinds of community-based development corporations. So there's a difference between community development corporations and community-based development corporations. These are more professional community development corporations that really don't have a connection to the community, a particular community that it's designed to serve, but it's more of a professional community development corporation that provides a set of services. Where community-based community development corporations typically are designed to respond to the needs of their own community, where they're like New Road would be considered a community-based, or historically would have been considered a community-based development corporation. We're, as many of you know now, we're kind of moving beyond that model because we get ready to do development projects in other parts of the county. And so we're kind of moving away from that model, more closely aligned with the typical traditional community development model. Other agencies, universities, there are a lot of extension offices that are connected to universities that do community economic development activities. A lot of that. I know Tuskegee University has invested in a lot of community economic development activities along with others. So let's kind of look at the strategic priorities of conventional economic development. This document is one that I put together, believe it or not, back in 2003. That's why it was so great. For an initiative that I did for a member of Congress a long time ago, called Initiative 7. The strategic priorities of conventional economic development are physical infrastructure, institutional capacity, and labor and capital. Those are the three primary areas where resources are invested. The basic objectives are to stimulate the geography of the regional economy. If it's a regional economic development initiative, what it could be just to stimulate the local economy if it's a local initiative. To support the private sector recruitment, right? Same thing we were talking about. Create revenue for the tax base. Those are the objectives of what conventional economic development are designed to do. And these are the people who do it: municipalities, industrial development boards, local development districts, state economic development entities, private sector entities, public and private sector development intermediaries, and others like regional planning commissions and things of that sort. The regional objectives, or the objectives if it's not a regional initiative, focus on creating industry clusters to stimulate the economy. So it would focus on those industry cluster sectors that have the greatest potential in that area, right? So if you were to think, I'm going to ask that question. If you were to think about the industry sector that have the greatest potential for investment on the Eastern Shore right now, which would you come up? What industry sectors would you think of?
Tourism.
Yeah.
Tourism.
And still agriculture.
What else?
Aquaculture.
What else?
See, I think one of the big opportunities is in recreation, and I don't think we're doing that at all.
Okay. And expand a little.
So, for example, I think that there's a whole bunch of stuff that we could get. So just as a really quick example, think about what resources we have. So we have all of these, people have these giant farms for trees where they don't plant anything. Imagine if someone had a great paintball thing where people would actually want to come over in groups and do paintball stuff. So I think that there are probably different kinds of activities. Just think about in the summertime, Camp Silver Beach or whatever it's called. The cars never stop coming by because they come to bring their kids to that camp. And that's the only one that I know of. So I just think that there are probably opportunities around recreation that we could do things that would be an investment for the community that would bring people in. But then I also think that there are just opportunities around recreation for people who live here, who have to go to Salisbury or have to go to Norfolk for any kind of entertainment, because there's absolutely not a thing, not a single bowling alley, not a single.
And those sound like excellent community economic development projects, right? So typically economic development projects are the things like we look at the manufacturing industry, people that make things. But oftentimes that particular industry is one that would be, I think, great for community economic development projects. So that kind of, so if you notice here, we said, this one assesses the industry sectors with the greatest potential, which is what we were just talking about. And but it relies heavily on recruitment because it is basically, you're kind of looking at those intersectors that will come into the region that would invest in that kind of work. So let's look at community economic development. Different priorities. It focuses on the local workforce. Typically, conventional economic development does not care where the workforce comes from. They care about the industry sector, and they want to they don't care who fills the jobs as long as the jobs are filled. So typically, if you build it, they will come. They just don't even have to come from here, they come from wherever. In community economic development, it's focused on the local workforce. You want to increase the capacity of the people in your area. And you want to increase the local institutional capacity, the organizations that are on the ground, your colleges, your schools, your high schools. And it focuses on physical infrastructure, but it's more designed to be targeted at the specific activities that you would do to support these things. So the concept that you just came up with, for example, you're not necessarily making widgets with the, so you don't necessarily have to do a massive recruitment strategy, right? That could be a homegrown initiative fostered by a local organization like Camp Silver Beach or Myers organization or our organization. Any one of our organizations could probably put that deal together and make it happen. And then you can go and get the resources to do it, right? You can still apply at some of the same places. Some of the same agencies that fund community development activity would fund that as a community economic development project. That would be different than where you go for an economic development package, right? So the basic objectives are to build asset-based local communities, right? To strengthen your local communities, strengthen the local economy, to invest in private sector stuff. Some of this is kind of conventional economic development activity, but it depends. Like if that business, if it's your local store, if it's your local neighborhood grocery store, if it's those businesses that directly impact where you live, where you stand, where you kind of live your life every day, that's the kind of activity that you would see in community economic development model. It creates revenue for a targeted local tax base. So we're trying to build up this part of, we're trying to build Bayside. And so we want to attract businesses to Bayside. We want to get stores and other kinds of business going on. That's the kind of community economic development incentives packages we're talking about. And of course, again, it focuses on a specific workforce, right? The people here. So when you think about community economic development, you think about where I live and who's impacted. So who are the organizations that would do that kind of work? You see it in community development corporations, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations. A lot of times, how do you think about churches that do a lot of community economic development? TD Jakes has one of the largest community development corporations in Dallas, Texas, the Potter's House. And it does housing and community economic development. I don't know if you're familiar with Bill Winston. Bill Winston is a pastor in Chicago, and he has a huge church in Chicago. If you go into his church, on one side, he bought a mall years ago, about 20 years ago, he bought a mall. And if you walk into this side of the mall is the church edifice, is the sanctuary and everything to do with church. That side of the mall, the part that opens up to the front is retail stores, banks, stores, department stores, jewelry stores, all kinds of stores on that side. It's how the church owns it, and it is under a separate community development corporation, and it is a whole set of businesses that operate under his community development corporation, but it's done by the church.
Are you going to give us or send us these slides?
Sure. Churches and locally owned businesses. There are some other state community economic development agencies, but for the most part, they would support the kind of work that goes on here. Community economic development should focus on creating regional community economic development zones to stimulate the local and regional economies. It should assess local resources, including those natural resources. So one of the things that I didn't hear us talk about, for example, is forestry and wood. What kind of things could we do here with our natural resources in our forestry and wood industry sector? Could we do paintball or I don't know, added value to wood products, right? Could we use our forestry, our forests and woodlands to add value to make wood products. Like North Carolina in the furniture industry, for example, it's a big industry in North Carolina.
Well, I was gonna just tell you, just about everywhere that I see here where I live, they're tearing down, the trees are all cut down, it's bare. On Occoquan Neck Road, there's 3 sections that are completely,
They're raising them, or what are they doing? Are they doing it?
the wood is coming out, the big trucks are going in and it's bare.
Are they gonna build something?
They're kicking them around, I don't know where they're going to, but wood is up, right? Timber is up,
Right.
so
Yeah.
some people have
Probably
decided
just
to.
selling timber. So the other kind, and I'll touch on this briefly, is the other kind of development is housing development. Housing development, so when we say housing development, typically you think community development, that kind of housing and development that is done by community-based organizations, right? Housing development, but housing development is real estate development. Housing development, real estate development that is done by nonprofit organizations and community development corporations is called housing development, but the process is no different than any other real estate development process. The funders are different, the language is even different in terms of the terms, you'll see that in a few seconds, but the process is the same. Housing development is basically real estate development that is done by organizations that are organized for the public good. Public service, nonprofit organizations, public government, any organization is kind of organized for the public good that is involved in the development of housing. Typically, that's what we call housing development, but it's basically development of real estate. I guess the distinction often is income, right? Who you're designing for, public good and who you're developing.
But that doesn't, housing development doesn't nest into the community development, because I look at it as community development. While you're building the community, you're also influencing the housing itself.
Right, and so a lot of times people will use housing development interchangeable with community development. Yeah, it is it is nested, but the distinction sometimes is you can be doing community development and not be doing housing, right?
Okay.
But if you're doing housing development, you also typically are doing some community development, but it's not the other way. The players in community development and housing development often are community development corporations, community action agencies oftentimes so in a lot of areas, community action agencies kind of function as CDCs, and so do community development corporations as community development corporations and do a lot of similar kinds of work. Again, the distinction here is community-based development corporations, meaning an area that kind of a community organization kind of has a catchment area where its focus is in a particular community or is represented by a particular demographic, right? So a community-based organization is one that is either located in a specific designated area or is represented in its governance and program by a specific demographic, right? So it can be located in a low-income community or have low-income people who run it and control it. And then public agencies. There's not a lot of that anymore. There aren't a lot of public housing agencies doing development. In fact, most of the public housing agencies around the country are doing private sector development, right? They are kind of farming out the actual development work to private sector developers and incentivizing them to do it rather than doing it themselves. Projects, what we historically would have known as projects, typically is the model that you would see where the public housing authority or agency itself is developing the housing and owns it, manages it, and so forth. That's kind of what we would know as projects. I don't think we have anything like that on this shore. But in other areas, if you're familiar with housing projects, those are the kind of projects that are developed. And even today, like I said, most of the public housing authorities are not even really focusing on that kind of work anymore. Simply, if you want to figure out what kind of development it is, though, follow the money. The money will let you know which of the 4 that we discussed is happening. If it's federal money, going to incentivize business, what kind of activity is it? So if it's federal, state dollars, or local dollars, it's government money, and it's going to incentivize or recruit an industry or a business to an area, or create jobs in a particular industry, what kind of activity is that? You know, right. So if it's public dollars that are going to incentivize a fire station or a community facility or a park, what kind of activity is that? Right. If it's a local community-based organization that is looking to develop a paintball park in a farm in Northampton County, what kind of activity is that? And of course, if it's a local organization that is looking to build housing that is affordable to a specific community, who is that? What's that? Follow the money. Typically, the money will tell you what kind of activity you're engaged in. So let's talk about the community development process quickly. And I spent a lot of time before I moved forward. I spent a lot of time going on that because a lot of time it's one of the places where they will confuse you, where you get easily confused when you go and knock on this door and say, I want to do such and such a thing, and say, oh, well, not really here, you can go over there. And, oh, well, we don't have the funding for that because you can't. If you understand what you're talking about and who's supposed to be doing it, you're in a better position to stand your ground and kind of ask more detailed questions, right? If you understand who the players are and what their role should be, even though I clearly said that there are some variations in the roles, in particularly here, that you don't find in other places. Don't get frustrated with that. We just have to figure out how to get it done. But we still know how it ought to be done, or how most places do it, right? Community development process. Engaging the process for doing community development activity pretty much is the same. I think everyone in this room has been involved in some part of the community development process in various kinds of projects. And as we go through those things, you'll be able to point them out. I'm going to ask you that. If you have gone through a community development process, you have been engaged in some community assessment process. You have been engaged in some kind of asset mapping. Asset mapping is the process by which you determine the amount of and quality of your social, human, what I want to do, make sure you say how to think so. They divide it into social capital, let's look at it, physical capital, human capital, and social capital, right? Asset mapping is how you look at your physical capital, your human capital, and your social capital in a particular defined area, right? We've all kind of been through the process where you kind of need to go through some kind of engagement or encounter with your local government. Myra, I know you guys have gone through that to get your planning and development approvals, right? If you're kind of focused on a specific kind of work, you spend a lot of time in that county as the government, going to hearings and having conversations with them, because there are layers of this process that you must go through your local government to accomplish, right? Community visioning, right? That is the process by which you kind of communicate with the folks in your area to talk about their ideas for what you'd like to accomplish, right? How do you see? We're about to go through one, so some of you guys know, we just took down 30 acres around the corner from us, going down Silver Beach Road. And one of the things that I'd like to do, right, because it's not a typical real estate development process, I want to engage in a visioning process with the people of the surrounding community to see how they like that site, right? What they like, because that's going to be a whole neighborhood, the size of New Road, right? And so if we're going to build a community of that size, right smack in there, in next door to New Road, then the people in New Road should have some, say in what the thing looks like. The folks who are coming out of Silver Beach would have an interest in what that community is
So,
gonna look
so
like.
where is it exactly? Is it where those cement houses used to be?
That field right across the street. Yep, so there's 30 acres right across the street from there, so it's a huge community, and so as we're developing that, I want feedback and vision. Every community development process should have stakeholders, right? Who are the people who have, as I was talking about, who are the people who have a vested interest in that activity? You want to engage them, because a lot of times, particularly in private sector development, one of the things that private sector development tends to do is shy away from this process because it slows things down. And then they run into problems down the road when the community gets all up in arms, like, no, we don't want that there, we don't like that. How did you do that way? That's going to infringe upon my this. Well, if they did this process, then oftentimes, if you're using public funds, they're going to require you to do in the community development process that the private sector typically does not have to go through. You can avoid a lot of those kind of problems. Most community development processes involve some kind of strategic planning. And then, of course, you have your implementation process, right? And so what are some of the pieces that you would look for in doing a community assessment? Who can help? When you're doing a community assessment, what do you think happens when you're going through the community assessment process? You look at the current status of that. You look at your census data. Look at data. Absolutely. Absolutely. So census data, what are some other kinds of data that you would look for when you're doing your community assessment?
Income.
Income would be one of the data that you would look for. Educational ability.
Jobs, surrounding jobs.
Surrounding jobs. What are some of the other kinds of sources? What are some of the means that you use to get that data? Surveys. What else? How else can we gather that data?
There's state and local data is already out there, so how do you find that data and to be able to bring it forth to what you need to invest in or what you want?
That's right. So you want to do, so there's two kinds of data, and Brenda kind of help me stop them. It's secondary data, primary data. Your primary data, you kind of collect from that's your source data, right? Primary data is the data that you get from your census data, from what you were just talking about, from the income, so all of those kind of things. That's your primary data. Your secondary data is, or is that no, it's the other way around. The secondary data is that. The primary data is the focus group, the people that you talk to, the surveys that you get, right? That's the information that you would get directly from the people who are providing you the information that you want to hear from, right? Your market.
It's the other way around.
It's
But
the other way
I
around.
understand what you're saying. But you have to have that data to give you the background for whatever you want to start with, because when the business side, they want to come here, they look at the community as to what are the resources.
Right.
So a lot of times they tell you, oh, that we gave you that, you don't have people.
Right.
You don't have the income.
Right.
To be able to base
You
that
don't have the
job.
skills, as she was
Well, that's
saying. You don't have the skills. You don't have the labor force to support whatever our initiative is, right? And so that's kind of all of these are the steps. I don't care what kind of community development project you were trying to implement. You're gonna go through some of these steps. There's housing, if it's business, if it's job training, whatever it is that you're trying to do, you're gonna go through some of these steps in order to develop your program, right? Those are kind of the cookie cutter steps that you're gonna go through. There are different ways, and what I was trying to say about what the surveys and the focus groups, there are different ways that you can do it. So when you're doing your stakeholder identification, sometimes they do charrettes, and sometimes they do stakeholder meetings. And some of you can come up with, you can be as creative as you can imagine, but going through this process, you need to hit on all of these things. Asset mapping is literally figuring out what we have available to do what we want to do in our community. How do we do what we want to do with what we have to do? I'm sharing this with you because this is one that I did way back in 2007. 3, I developed something called the Comprehensive Community Development Model. And it involved, this will look familiar to some of you who have worked with me over the years in different ways. I developed this model years ago. So people often ask, how come you are doing the Housing Coalition? How come you're doing the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission? How come you're doing these various different models that you see? If you think about all the work that you kind of have seen me do over the last several years, when we did the Comprehensive Planning Advisory Committee down in Northampton County to rewrite the economic development portion of the comprehensive plan. Similar process. It always will involve research, information, strategy, and initiative, right? Most community development processes that you are involved in, whether it's a large scale thing that covers 12 states or 7 states, or whether it's a small thing that covers 2 towns or 1 town or just your organization, you want to first gather all the information that you can with the research, like we just talked about, right? You want to get, and in my work, I typically work with universities and colleges because I do regional work, right? And so, but then you also want to have your practical information, right? You want to get that information from those who are doing it on the ground, right? Does it make sense to kind of only talk about the theory of community economic development, as it said earlier, as an academic discipline, but without involving those who have actual practical experience on the ground, right? Because there are going to be things that we understand that are not understood here, and things that are understood here that are not really felt over here. So you need both working together. And then you need to come together with those things with now fully armed with all the information and develop your strategy, right? Again, you need both pieces of information and both lines at work to kind of develop whatever your strategy is for the project that you're trying to pursue. And then once you kind of develop your strategy, then you can kind of harvest out the steps to make it happen. Where's step 1 all the way through? If you look at the Regional Housing Coalition, what is it but this? Right? If you've been following the work that we do with the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission, what is it but this? It's always the same model, right? And once you kind of have the model down, you can do this work over and over again in various disciplines. You can do it in housing, you can do it in education, you can do it in community development, you can do it in community economic development, you can do it in any kind of variation of the work within these disciplines that you do. I'm going to show you a video now of one that I was involved in, where that model came from a long time ago. I'll show it to you quickly. PowerPoint. I mean, on the Zoom.
It's very fuzzy, whatever it is.
Okay, good. That's what you're supposed to see. Okay, good. There we go.
Yeah, see it now.
Low income, largely agricultural, which is a dying economy for the country. But it's also an area that has rich cultural heritage, rich potential in its people, rich potential in the natural resources. So the question for a long time has been, how do we invest in the assets that we have in the district so that we can create a new Blackstone?
On taking the first step. When I look at West Alabama, what I see is a lot of
Former
potential and the heart is something positive.
Shortly after our Davis won,
Who is her? That is her 20 years ago.
What?
First time to take academic research studies that have been conducted, have it translated into real life language, real life opportunities and experiences that they can take and use within the community.
What we really envision is that District 7 will launch a series of projects that are indigenous, homegrown projects in the region that will address everything from healthcare to education to workforce development, various other strands of community growth and development.
I have to think of it as just that as a pipeline. You're building a building, then you want to, in order to get the building up, you have to create the infrastructure. You have to have the water, you have to have the sewer, you have to have the gas, you have to have the electric in order for the building to go up. If we're going to build a Blackstone, we have to have some more infrastructure, but it has to be around the issue of creating wealth for people. So the community, people in the community have to have technical assistance, they have to have capacity building, they have to have resources, and they have to have quality and leadership that is willing to stay in there for the long haul and provide the sustainability that they need. So that was people first in the conference, and over 200 people showed up. And then we came
There's a
back
guy,
later
the
and
guy that was
out
here,
to the
back
community.
with the ball.
Let them set the criteria, let them set the objectives, let them set the priorities. And then once they had set those, then we said, now bring us your ideas, bring your project, tell us what you're thinking about doing.
These meetings are held once a month, and so the building process, we're able to see people take a simple idea, something that they see as being a need in their community, and seeing those ideas being formulated into projects that finally into conception.
The models that came forward were sophisticated, they were exciting, they were well articulated. People knew what they wanted, they knew what they needed. All they needed was for District 7 to be there to provide the pipeline, and they're ready to go.
So what I wanted to take a chance to share with you guys what a comprehensive community development process looks like, right? That was one that I took. It was a 12-county region in the Black Belt of Alabama, what's called the Black Belt of Alabama. I can't remember the congressman, Terry Sewell of Alabama is her district today. But back then, it was the 7th Congressional District of Congressman Arthur Davis. And I had just finished going through a lengthy process like this with the University of Georgia and Tuskegee University, where we traveled around a 7-state region gathering data using a survey tool, community development survey tool, asking questions of people in community organizations all around the region. University of Georgia gathered data from the planning district commissions, the government, the quasi-governmental organizations. Their job was to gather the data from the quasi-governmental organizations. My job with Tuskegee University was to gather data from the community-based organizations, and together we were supposed to put together a comprehensive study on the southeast region of the United States in terms of its persistent poverty, and to figure out what were the challenges that were facing people who had been plagued with persistent poverty for generations, and then what would be necessary to help to lift them out of persistent poverty. And really, we're trying to make the argument for a federal commission. So that's how I got involved in the work of the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission all those years ago. So after I finished that process with University of Georgia and Tuskegee, and the study went up to Congress, he called me and said, "What are you going to do now? I really enjoyed what I read in the study, and I'd like to implement some of these things in my district, in the 7th Congressional District." And what you just saw in the video was the result of the model that I, as Senior Economic Development Advisor to him, put together. And that's what you saw. So what we did, we went through another process like this. For him, we used the University of Alabama. We went all around the region and gathered data from community-based organizations, used some of the stuff that we got from the Tuskegee study. The strategy sessions, that's what you saw that day. You saw me on the stage there. We spent a whole Saturday at Wallace State Community College in Selma, Alabama, brought people around, at 300 people to come from all around his 12-county district and talk about, did strategy sessions, to talk about what they needed in that region. We kind of took them through in that day, all of it, right? We walked in with the data and the asset maps. If you saw the thing that said zones, one of the things that we asked the University of Alabama to do is divide that 12-county region up into zones, economic zones, that kind of we said, look at this region as people live, not as the lines are drawn, right? So where do people go to work? How do they travel? Where do they live? Where do they go to church? Where do they shop? And if you travel there, tell us how this area, what industries are, so many times we'll find Acrobat County probably has more in common with Lower Maryland than it does with Northampton County in many ways, right? So if you were to look at where people in northern Acrobat actually live and work and travel, they probably go north more than they come south, right? So the way the dollars move around, that economy probably is very different in northern Acrobat than the economy of southern Accomack, northern Northampton County to southern Northampton County. So we asked them to take his district apart and to look at the region as it was designed, as people lived their lives. And then we got together, we took all that data with us on the Saturday, and we took all those folks through this process so that we could come up with a plan. And then our implementation was to let people bring us their project ideas and then give them the technical assistance and the resources and training that they would need to bring those ideas to fruition after the model. Once you get through that process, then what comes happens? Like hopefully, right, if people go through a community development planning process, you go through, you do the visioning, you do the assets, you figure out what resources you have to work with, you know who you need to go talk to get those resources. You got all of that in place. Hopefully what comes out of that? Hopefully out of that comes a project, right? And that project could be a community development project, like what we just talked about. It could be a community economic development project. It could be a housing project like my cousin Deborah does. It could be a lot of different models, right? It could be whatever, or it could be a project to get the infrastructure into your community like mine is doing so that you can prepare for a housing development project, right? Or it could be a combination of all those. When you're thinking about the development process, again, just like the community development process, there are steps that you go through in the development process. You're going to go through your site identification. You're going to need to do your feasibility analysis. You're going to need to get your planning and development approvals, site control. So the contract that we just signed a couple of days ago was not to buy the land, but it was for me to have site control. So I signed my 1-year option on the DO plan so that I can do my due diligence and the master planning and everything that we need to do to make sure the site is buildable and what kind of design you want and all of those things. So typically you won't buy the land before you do the development. These are the things that we're going to go into in the next session, right, to get into more detail. But typically you don't necessarily need to acquire the property in order to develop the property right away. You need to just have site control of the property. Most lenders, that's all they require to have. Then you work on your financing and then building construction and of course whether you're going to sell it or lease it. So those are the steps that you have to think about in the development process. And like I said, we'll go into more detail of those things. Typically in the development process, you have the developer, which in our case, we're the community developer. You have a public process. We have a city agency. Most of the time, that would be your planning and zoning department that you would work through. Financing, if you're in the private sector, of course, typically it's the bank or some other type of institutional lender. In the public sector or nonprofit sector, it's typically going to be your state agencies, your government type of funding. Although there are some private sector funds that you might assemble or kind of fold into your funding mix when you're going to do it. And then you have your permitting process, which is what we just completed for our project that we're doing right now in the neighborhood. And then you do construction. Our project is going to be about 8 months long, the one that we just started yesterday. Throughout the construction, the building inspector comes out and inspects the property to make sure that the building contractors are doing it to their standards. And then eventually you have to sell the house. And that's going to be what we do. That property that we're building is for sale. But if you're going to lease it, you need to do the same thing. And then there's another step after this. If it's a rental property, which is property management, that either you're going to do it yourself or you're going to find a property manager who will kind of oversee the process. Those are the steps that you're going to go through in any development process, whether you're private or public or nonprofit community developer. All of these things happen. Sometimes in the public development process, meaning you're using public funds, community development process, there will be additional steps, right? They will want you to do a housing needs assessment. In the private sector, they will do what they call a market analysis to determine if the thing makes sense, but they are not required. Typically, you will be required to do a housing needs assessment. You will be required to do stakeholder meetings. In the private sector, those will be your focus groups. And that will be enough. Everybody is gonna do some preliminary site planning, but it's required when you're using public dollars. Your feasibility studies are also required. They want to make sure that the numbers work, that when you tell them, this is what I want to build, this is what I expect the rents to be or the sale price to be, this is what we expect the property to yield back to us, that's where your feasibility studies are done. If the site can hold that kind of development, if you have the infrastructure in the ground to support the sewer system, the water system, whether you have utilities there, how much is it gonna cost to get utilities there, all of that stuff goes on in the feasibility studies. In your engineering reports, a lot of those things are also covered in your engineering reports. They also gonna do your environmental assessments and stuff is part of your infrastructure and environmental reports. This is done by an engineering firm. This is typically done by an environmental company, assessment company. Your architectural reports will kind of just make sure that the kind of housing that you want. A lot of this is redundant, but they will require it. The funding agencies will require it anyway. But they will also give you money to do it. It just takes time, which is another reason why a lot of times private sector doesn't really bother with our processes, because it is a little bit longer and more involved, right? Cost reports are your estimates that you'll get from your contractors or your architects to let you know what it's going to cost. So there are two types of development. Development is actually not construction, right? So the development is actually what happens on the ground and under the ground. Development is the roads, the utilities, the water and sewer infrastructure. That's development. That's called land development. Once you get the site developed, then you do construction. Construction is the actual buildings, the structures on the ground. So you have your site development, and then you have your construction. So this is horizontal and this is vertical. And then of course, once you get done, you have to do your marketing to promote the activity, whether you're gonna sell it or lease it. That will be determined by the project. I just kind of wanted, I've kind of already drawn these distinctions, but I wanted to kind of point out the differences between an affordable housing developer versus a private developer. An affordable housing developer, they say, where I got this from, they say will usually move quickly through the building permit and construction stage, as is the nature of a publicly financed housing development, because you're accountable to public agencies. But a private developer has the option to proceed with construction or wait. I mean, to me, that's not the real distinction. To me, the real distinction is the source of the funds, right? As I said, follow the money. Private sector developers typically will get their money from private sector sources. You can have models, however, where you partner, public-private partnerships, where a private sector developer can partner with a public sector entity, or a nonprofit sector entity, so that you can get. So there's a bit of this is the end, and I'll take questions at the end. But there's a big move. Years ago, there was this big model called Hope 6, and I don't know if you lived in any of the urban areas. They did a big one down in Atlanta years ago for the Olympics. When they were getting ready for the Olympics in Atlanta, they had the I can't remember what was the name of those projects right downtown.
Bowen Homes.
They were big. It's where the Olympic Stadium, where the stadium was. It was a big public housing project. But anyway, they tore it down to put back a new development, actually mixed use development. And it was the first round of what they called Hope 6. It was a HUD initiative called Hope 6. And it was designed to upgrade public housing. So public housing that was going downhill. That was it. That was it. When they tore, so the way that the project map was designed, they tore them down. They could come back with a third of the residents who were there. So 2/3 of the residents had to be relocated, a third of the residents could come back. Then they would get, I forgot how many billions of dollars from HUD. HUD would give them like 35 million, I forgot how much, $35 million. And then they would give the housing authority would donate the land, so everybody was part, right? So the HUD was giving them money as an incentive. The housing authority was giving them the land as an incentive. And the private sector developer could then take the money from HUD and the land donation to their private sector lender and have equity in their deal, right? Because those things were granted to them. The money was a grant, was an equity, was a grant, the land was a grant. Then they could take that to the funder and buy down the cost of the project so that they could borrow more and therefore be able to make this affordable housing property doable. Because one of the things that people would say, right, often is it's hard to do affordable housing because there's no money in it, right? So that's one of the ways that the federal government came up with through HUD to incentivize affordable housing in communities that were experiencing urban fights, which in that case to get ready for the Olympics.